It's October 26th, 1836. Survivors of the ship Royal Tar have just arrived in Isle Ojo, Maine, after a narrow escape from the stricken ship in Penobscot Bay. As a collective, they write of their experience. We, the undersigned, being a part of the survivors, passengers on board the steamer Royal Tar at the time she was destroyed by fire, on the passage from St. John to Portland, hereby tender our grateful acknowledgments to Captain Thomas Reed for his extraordinary exertions and perseverance in saving the lives of his passengers, while in such imminent danger during the time said boat was on fire, the wind blowing a severe gale. It was difficult to convey the passengers from the burning vessel, in a small boat, to the cutter which came to our assistance and was the only means of saving our lives, the longboat, with 16 persons, having left on the first discovery of the fire. Of the 93 on board, 32 perished, along with most of the animals of a traveling menagerie. The Circus ship Royal Tar, today, on Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs. Hello and welcome to Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs, tales of mishaps, misfortune, and misadventure. Thank you so much for listening. Shipwreck stories from history always involve tragedy, grief, and loss. When a ship goes down, it is of course a horrible and frightening experience, and the loss of any lives is a tragedy. Mixing this with a ship full of helpless, confused, and frightened animals adds a horrifying element, producing a chaotic and terrible scene. The story of the Royal Tar is exactly that. The Royal Tar was built by William and Isaac Olive at their shipyard in Carleton, New Brunswick, Canada, and launched in November of 1835. It was the first steamer to travel between St. John, New Brunswick, Eastport, Maine, and Portland, Maine. She was a wooden, sidewheel paddle steamer, 160 feet long by 24 feet wide, 400 tons, and rigged for sail as a schooner for wind-powered assistance. The ship's name, Royal Tar, was a nickname of King William IV of the United Kingdom, who was also referred to as the Sailor King. The American Navigation Act of 1817 placed restrictions on coastal shipping. Direct cargo transport from foreign ports to American ports such as Boston and New York were heavily restricted, but New Brunswick investors John Hammond, Daniel McLaughlin, and Mackey Brothers and Company decided to build a fast steamer that could take passengers and cargo to Portland, Maine. From Portland, the passengers and freight could be transferred to Boston, New York, and other ports. The Royal Tar was a well-built and fast ship and made the 60-mile trip from Eastport to St. John in record time, just under 5 hours. It was a beautiful ship for her time, with elegant passenger cabins and comforts that rivaled the nicest hotels. By the 1830s, steam engines had been around for over 100 years, but practical steam travel on the water was relatively new. Robert Fulton's successful launch of the Clermont in 1807 began a boom for this revolutionary transportation method. Steamboat routes quickly emerged along major rivers, canals, the Great Lakes, coastal waters, to the West Indies, and even transatlantic routes between the U.S. and Europe. Steamships offered faster travel for passengers and potential for increased profits for their operators. However, as was often the case, safety regulations did not keep up with the technology. Boiler explosions and fires were common, but steamboat travel continued to flourish. Nevertheless, the owners of the Royal Tar described her as the safest ship on the seas. On October 21, 1836, the Royal Tar was docked at Peters Wharf in Eastport, Maine, after its first uneventful leg of its journey from St. John, New Brunswick. On board were 21 crew, 72 passengers, and the entire complement of Burgess and Dexter's Zoological Institute, a traveling menagerie of animals and entertainment. This outfit consisted of two portions, Dexter's Locomotive Museum, referring to it being a mobile unit, and Burgess's collection of serpents and birds. On board was the collection of animals, vehicles, and equipment needed for the shows. This was an enormous caravan managed by a man named Mr. Fuller, and included a brass band, an elephant, a team of horses, 2 camels, a Bengal tiger, zebra, hyena, 2 lions, and a wide variety of birds and reptiles. To make room for the animal cages, 2 of the ship's 4 lifeboats were removed. In addition to the animals, the Royal Tar was carrying several heavy wagons and an omnibus, a large show wagon which was pulled by the horses. This was big business at the time and required a heavy investment and large-scale promotion. The company had just completed a number of performances during its tour of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia and was on its way back to Boston. The Royal Tar left Eastport, Maine on October 21st, but the strong winds almost immediately caused her to pull into Little River and drop anchor. The weather had been rough in late October and further delayed the ship's departure. The crew, passengers, and animals stayed on board for several days waiting for the weather to break. On October 25th, Captain Thomas Reed saw a break and ordered his engineers to build up steam for departure. Just shortly after exiting the harbor, the wind blew hard again from the northwest as the Royal Tar was crossing Penobscot Bay. The ship's boilers were under the direction of Second Engineer Mr. N. Marshall. At about 1:30 p.m., Marshall had left the boiler in the care of a fireman, who was acting as Marshall's assistant. The boiler began to leak, a development spotted by the son of the ship's pilot, Mr. Atkins. When the boy notified his father, Marshall was notified and directed to repair the problem. However, Mr. Marshall neglected to do so, apparently disregarding the problem entirely, telling the pilot, Mr. Atkins, in so many words, to mind his own business. The boiler continued to leak, causing it to empty of water. With no water, the metal boiler became red hot and ignited the wooden support wedges placed directly overhead, meant to support the weight of the animals in the cages. The ship's furnace was extinguished, but the fire continued to burn in the area under the deck, above the boiler, and near the animal cages. When Captain Reed was notified, he ran to the area and looked down through the grating. What he saw was a raging fire and the imminent destruction of his ship. He immediately ordered his engine stopped and the safety valve opened, and he brought the Royal Tar to anchor about 1.5 miles from the Fox Islands. Efforts were made to extinguish the flames by means of a hose attached to a pump, but this proved fruitless. The fire spread rapidly and soon consumed the firefighting equipment, prompting the crew to give up and save themselves. Captain Reed hoisted the distress signal, which would later prove to be valuable. As the ship continued to burn, people and animals shrieked in terror and began jumping overboard. Captain Reed hoisted the sails, set the jib, and attempted to make for the nearest land at the Fox Islands. But the fire quickly consumed the ship's sails and rigging, making any navigation impossible. The horses and camels were pushed overboard in the hopes they could swim to shore. The elephant, named Mogul, was seen crashing down upon a makeshift raft, destroying the raft and killing those who were on it. It was truly a sad and tragic scene of panic and suffering. What happened next is described by Captain Reed himself.
The steam being down after we had been at anchor about half an hour, the boat was discovered to be on fire, immediately over the boiler and under the deck. The cable was slipped instantly, and the fire engine set to work. But in 5 minutes the men could not stand at the pump, which was below, the smoke nearly suffocating them. At this awful juncture there was a rush for the boats, there being only 2. 16 of the passengers and crew took the largest boat and went away before the wind, which blew so hard they were afraid to bring her near. I got possession of the jolly boat with 2 men. Mr. Sherwood, Mr. Fowler, and another man belonging to the caravan jumped overboard, and we picked them up.
Captain Reed had taken the smaller of the 2 lifeboats. He and the other men began pulling survivors out of the water and preparing rafts and flotation devices. Cabin passengers frantically rushed for the longboat, which was the larger of the two. 16 passengers boarded the lifeboat, released its cables, and lowered themselves into the water. Despite the longboat being roughly half empty, they immediately rowed away, leaving behind others who could have been saved. They successfully rowed 9 miles to the Isle Oho, where they were given shelter by a man named Mr. Kimball. After about 30 minutes, and having spotted the distress signal, the U.S. revenue cutter Vito arrived on the scene. It carried rescue boats, but they were very small and proved to be useless to aid in the rescue. Captain Reed, spotting the cutter, ordered the men in his lifeboat to row for her, but they refused, as it was going against the wind. Reed, not accepting their disobedience, took control of the situation, exclaiming,
"I was captain of the big boat, and damn me if I won't be captain of the small one. If any man won't pull for the cutter, I will throw him overboard."
The men complied and began rowing. The Vito was armed with a full powder magazine and easily could have been destroyed by taking a position too close to the burning steamer. The Vito drew near the Royal Tar while remaining at a safe distance from the vessel, which was now an inferno. Terrified, screaming passengers yelled for the cutter to draw nearer as they were holding on to burning ropes dangling from the ship. The manager of the caravan, Mr. Fuller, was one of these holding on for dear life. His strength was failing, and the rope became twisted around his neck. Others clung to the same rope, and one woman hung on to Fuller's leg. The rope was cut to prevent Fuller from being strangled to death. Mr. Fuller, who would survive the ordeal, later wrote, "On Tuesday the 25th, about 2 p.m., the steamer Royal Tar was discovered to be on fire. Being sick in my berth, it was some time before I was aware of the fact. When I came on deck, the flames reached from the quarterdeck to the foremast, both boats filled and gone. The longboat, with 16 heartless fellows, had rowed off and was soon out of sight. Captain Reed, in the small boat, lay to near the steamer. We made a signal, which was fortunately discovered by the United States cutter Vito, then about 4 miles distant. She bore up for us, the wind blowing a gale, and fortunately arrived in time to save a great number, Captain Reed in the small boat carrying them from the burning wreck to the cutter. I was the last to leave the quarterdeck and was driven off by the fire, and after hanging nearly 3 hours in the water, was taken off in the last boat that went from the stern. 5 boatloads were afterwards taken from the bows, the last about 5:30 p.m. There were about 30 persons lost, 4 of our company. It was owing to the exertions of Captain Reed that any, excepting those in the longboat, were saved, and had they been as diligent, nearly all would have been. The camels, elephant, pony, and some of the horses were thrown overboard, and we hope they reached shore. I have sent to ascertain. Every trunk was lost. I must not forget to mention that the pilot, Mr. Adkins, the mate, Mr. Black, and the steward, Mr. Brown, used every exertion throughout this terrible scene." An article in the St. John Daily Sun from August 31, 1903, described the tragedy. The scene of horror that ensued may in part be imagined. The steamer was ablaze in the middle, while the crew and passengers rushed to and fro at the bow and stern. The shouts of excited men and shrieks of helpless women and the wails of little children were mingled with the roars of the imprisoned beasts, while the fierce crackling of advancing flames told the increasing peril that came with every moment. With 93 people in peril of death, the only way of escape was in 2 boats, capable of carrying less than a third of that number. Several of the women, despairing of rescue, threw their children into the sea and jumped after them. One woman swam 3 times around the steamer before she sank and was drowned. One man was seen stuffing silver dollars into his pockets before jumping overboard. He sank instantly and was never seen again. The crew of the Vito continued working, as did Captain Reed, taking as many on board as possible. At the time, the U.S. Revenue Cutter Service had no obligation to provide assistance to vessels from British North American colonies, but nevertheless took on the responsibility. Captain Reed and Steward W.G. Brown continued to pick up survivors out of the water in their lifeboat and transfer them to the Vito. Captain Reed and all the others who boarded the Vito were then taken to Eastport, and then later boarded the vessel Plowboy, and reached St. John the following Saturday. The flaming hulk of the Royal Tar drifted for 4 hours before sinking beneath the waves, about 9 kilometers from Vinyl Haven Island, Maine. One of the men who absconded in the longboat, Stimson Patton of New Brunswick, later wrote, "We have lost all our baggage and goods, which is but trifling considering the circumstances. Captain Reed took charge of the stern boat with 2 men, and kept her off the steamboat, which was a very fortunate circumstance, as it was the means of saving from 40 to 50 persons, and to him all credit is due for his deliberate and manly perseverance throughout the whole calamity. It is impossible to describe the appalling spectacle which the whole scene presented. The boat wrapped in flames, with nearly 100 souls on board without any hope of relief, rending the air with the shrieks for help. And what rendered the scene still more distressing, the caravan of wild beasts were on deck, ready to tear in pieces all that might escape the flames. The amount of money and property lost by the disaster cannot be less than £25,000. Mr. Patton mentioned nothing of the half-empty lifeboat. A fisherman named William Barter from Isle au Haut picked up survivors as well. He provided them with food and shelter, even slaughtering a lamb to feed them. Some received feather beds, while others found space on his floor. The following day, these survivors were taken to the town of Thomaston in Maine. Sadly, of the 93 people on board, 32 were lost, including 29 passengers and 3 of the crew, including the stewardess Margaret Watts. The pilot, Mr. Atkins, and his son both survived, as did the second engineer, Mr. N. Marshall, who escaped on the half-empty longboat. All of the helpless animals perished, but for 2 horses who swam ashore. Some of the horses were terrified and confused and swam in circles around the burning ship rather than heading for shore, and they eventually drowned. Days later, the body of Mogul the elephant was seen drifting off of Brimstone Island. While Captain Reed was on this fatal last voyage of the Royal Tar saving others, his 7-year-old son became ill and died. His shock and dismay cannot even be imagined when he discovered this news upon his return home. Later, Captain Reed was awarded with $621 in gold for his bravery in saving so many, and steward W.G. Brown was given $110. Reed was appointed harbor master of St. John in 1840, and he passed away in 1861. For many years, the St. John men who survived the disaster met annually on the 15th of October. One of the last of these survivors was George Eaton, who died on the 20th of October, 1886. An investigation confirmed that the fire was caused by the boiler being allowed to run dry. Responsibility was squarely placed on the ship's second engineer, Mr. N. Marshall. The empty boiler had become red hot, igniting the timbers above, which were reinforced to withstand the weight of the animals. The wooden bulkhead began to smolder until they ignited. By the time the ship's furnace was extinguished, the fire was already out of control. As a result of this gruesome tragedy, and after considering the crucial role of the U.S. Revenue Cutter Service, the United States Secretary of the Treasury issued an order for American vessels to carry emergency supplies and begin actively patrolling the eastern seaboard, looking for vessels in distress, no matter their nationality. The order was issued on January 9, 1837, and American cutters provided assistance to New Brunswick seamen immediately afterwards. Steamboat accidents were common in the early 19th century, with boiler explosions being especially feared. Inferior metallurgy practices of the time, as well as improper cleaning and maintenance of the boiler tubes, resulted in thousands of deaths and many more injuries. When boilers exploded, they sent red-hot shards of metal flying through the air and scalded anyone nearby with steam. Little, if any, oversight was given to safety, and no inspection standards or regulations were in place to ensure the safety of the passengers and crew. Shortly after the Royal Tar tragedy, the explosion of steamboat Moselle in 1838 proved to be the final straw leading to the first real safety reforms. 150 people were ripped to shreds when its boiler exploded on the Cincinnati riverfront, in full view of hundreds of spectators. Later that same year, with a growing number of steamboat accidents and fatalities, the federal government passed the Act of 1838 to, quote, provide for the better security of passengers on board vessels propelled in whole or in part by steam. This was badly needed legislation, and a first step of many more to come. It contained vaguely worded regulations, but included the creation of inspectors for steam vessels, who would inspect the hulls, boilers, and their associated machinery. These inspectors were assigned to specific ports by a local federal district court judge. The inspectors were in charge of certifying any steam vessels that operated out of their port. Enforcement was difficult, and payoffs and corruption were not uncommon. But this was the first federal regulation of private industry for safety reasons, and set the precedent for consumer protection laws. As news of the Royal Tar disaster spread, so did rumors of its valuable sunken treasure. As was customary at the time, passengers often brought their valuables on board ships, and these would have been carefully logged and stored in the ship's safe. Anything of value belonging to the company would also be placed in the safe. Items often included cash, bonds, gold and silver bullion or coins, and jewels. On November 12, 1836, just a few weeks after the Royal Tar sank, a schooner arrived in Portland, reporting seeing a burning, sinking vessel. A floating trunk was recovered, with $90 cash inside, and this remains the only known item recovered from the wreck. Months later, a salvage company attempted to locate the Royal Tar and its safe, but found nothing. Many more attempts have been made since, but neither the Royal Tar nor its safe have ever been found. It is estimated the Royal Tar safe would be worth approximately $1 million today. In 2009, author Chris Van Dusen published a children's book called The Circus Ship, which is loosely based on the story of the Royal Tar. In this version, all the animals swim to nearby Vinyl Haven and are taken in and loved by the residents. In July of 2024, lobsterman Mike Billings of Stonington, Maine, pulled up a 6-foot-long, barnacle-encrusted anchor in Penobscot Bay after his lines were caught upon it. Billings and others believe it could be from the Royal Tar, but some say the Royal Tar sank much further to the south. John Johansson, historical researcher and president of the board of directors of the Penobscot Maritime Museum, believes the anchor to be about 150 years old. As of yet, there has been no definitive proof that the anchor is from the Royal Tar, and Johansson says it is unlikely the anchor is from the ship. But Billings remains hopeful, saying, "It's a huge mystery that would be great to solve. The thing that's really great is it sparked so much interest and curiosity in people." Roger Green, whose family has owned land on Deer Isle, Maine for over 100 years, has heard the stories and the legends of the Royal Tar passed down over the years.
My grandparents lived in Maine, and we would go visit them in the summers. During the Depression, they had bought an old farmhouse on Deer Isle, which is an island within Penobscot Bay. You know, going there as kids, we would hear the local stories. I mean, it was a very historic place. The house was really old. The island was known for maritime history. The story of the Royal Tar was one of many folklore stories that we heard growing up. We used to put on little plays in the house for the relatives and whatnot as kids growing up. The Royal Tar itself was just kind of in the background. Where it sank was off the island of either Vinyl Haven or North Haven, which is a half-hour, 45-minute boat ride from where we were on Deer Isle. So we certainly were in the waters where that happened growing up as a kid. You know, because it was a circus ship and all these animals perished, along with people, of course. It was one of those stories that stuck around. And as I spent summers there, you'd hear about it. You would see mentions of it. You know, the paper, there might be an anniversary date that came along that they would talk about it. There would be talk about finding the shipwreck. I guess it's in pretty deep water. As the island developed, I would notice more mentions of of the Royal Tar. There's a museum on the island called the Island Historical Society. And then when I was there last summer, I went to the museum for the first time in a very long time. And there was, of course, the story of the Royal Tar. And I believe I saw some newspaper clippings and maybe even a painting or two of depiction of the disaster. And it just kept popping up on my visit. I went to a local coffee shop. They've got a blend called the Royal Tar Blend. And for sale in their store, they've got a little children's book called Circus Ship. And it's a wonderfully illustrated book. It talks about that it caught on fire and sank because it's a children's book. It doesn't talk about all the people that died and the animals that perished.
That's going to do it for the Circus Ship, the Royal Tar Tragedy. Thank you for listening. Special thanks to Roger Green for providing a bit of local perspective about this story. Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is written, edited, and produced by me, Rich Napolitano. As an independent podcast, I appreciate the support of my listeners, and you can help support the show by making a contribution of any amount at buymeacoffee.com/shipwreckspod. You can also subscribe to Into History and get ad-free listening, bonus content, early access, and more to some of the best history podcasts available, including this one. Subscribe at intohistory.com/shipwreckspod. You can follow Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky at ShipwrecksPod. You can find all episodes, show notes, sources, and merchandise at shipwrecksandseadogs.com. Original theme music is provided by Sean Siegfried, and you can find him at seansiegfried.com. Please join me again in 2 weeks. But until then, don't forget to wear your life jackets.